Hi. So in previous content, we've covered how caffeine affects our performance. It tends to improve our performance. So when looking at lifting performance or endurance performance, it doesn't seem to matter. It tends to improve our ability to lift weights or to get an extra repetition or to decrease the time that it takes to cycle or to run or any sort of endurance performance. But there's a caveat here in that there is a potential gene effect in that in your liver you have this enzyme that may affect the metabolism of caffeine, and in doing so may actually affect if you gain a performance benefit from caffeine, and in certain respects may actually be detrimental to your performance. So for certain individuals in the population, those individuals would want to avoid caffeine. So that's what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be covering two studies that try to investigate this. And previously I'd broken up the endurance studies and the lifting studies, but in this video I'd like to combine the two. So we're going to cover how caffeine, or this gene in our liver, affects our caffeine metabolism, and in that way also affects our performance in lifting performance as well as endurance. If you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and I already hold my master's in exercise physiology, and I love dissecting research, which is why we're here. This is a detailed study analysis, so we're going to go into the nitty-gritty of all the details. So that said, let me go ahead and jump into what we're going to be covering, or the two studies that we're going to be covering. So the gene that we're interested in is called CYP1A2, and that is the one that's found in the liver. So as I mentioned, we're going to cover endurance performance as well as resistance training. But more specifically, what exactly are we going to cover? So we're going to cover if caffeine improves resistance training performance as well as endurance performance. And as I mentioned, so the answer is yes, but I'm going to actually show you the data so that you don't have to just believe what I say or go back to my previous content. We're also going to cover how does this liver enzyme affect our performance. And then I'm also going to go over the mechanisms of caffeine's performance effects. So going into the nitty-gritty physiology of once you consume caffeine, what happens? How does caffeine affect all these different organ systems to then lead to this performance benefit? And then if you're part of my Physionic Insiders community, then you also get access to the unabridged version of, or the complete version of this detailed analysis, where we're also going to investigate how caffeine affects power. And I don't mean that as in like, "Muhahaha, I have the power." It's not like a Marvel movie or anything. It's a literal power output by your musculature. So the ability to lift heavy weights. So not just lifting performance in terms of being able to get more repetitions, but can you lift a weight more quickly, for example? That would be power. And then I'm also going to be covering for the insiders a major problem that is found with one of these studies that I'll explain in that section. If you'd like access to all 5 of these topics, then I'll post a link so that you can hop on over and subscribe to the Physionic Insiders, and there you'll get access to this as well as all my other full detailed study analyses. But if you're interested in just these first 3 questions, then stick around. Let's get into this. All right, so as I mentioned, in our liver we have this gene. So here we've got a genetic material that I drew out, and if we focus in on a particular section of that genetic material, we have a gene known as the CYP gene, or more specifically CYP1A2 gene. And this gene ends up producing an enzyme known as cytochrome P450. So this enzyme, cytochrome P450, will take caffeine, so caffeine is in the bloodstream, and it enters into the hepatocytes, or the liver cells, and once it enters the liver cells, this gene will, or this enzyme I should say, will bind to caffeine and turn it into its respective metabolites, or break it down into other molecules. So while those molecules aren't quote unquote inert, they do have a function as well. We're going to be focused on caffeine specifically. So some people, however, have a slower variant or mutation of this enzyme, meaning that some people have this gene with a slight alteration to the gene that leads to the protein that's produced, the enzyme that's produced, to be less effective, as in it can't bind caffeine as well, it can't metabolize it from caffeine into its metabolites to break it down nearly as well. So it tends to be slower at breaking down caffeine. So some people in the population have the ability to metabolize caffeine quickly. Some people have a more moderate or slower way of breaking down caffeine, and then we've got a certain population that have a really slow metabolism of caffeine. And that's what we're going to be investigating, how this gene, when we consume caffeine, affects our performance in respect, again, to caffeine consumption. Okay, so to get into this, to actually go into some of the physiology, let me remove myself here real quick. So here are just a few of the mechanisms. This is don't worry, we're not going to go over each one of these small sections, but I do want to give you kind of I don't want to say big picture, because we're definitely getting into some nitty gritty here. Let's say medium picture, a semi-detailed analysis. So here we've got caffeine, and caffeine is circulating in the bloodstream, so you consume caffeine, and it will bind to the adrenal glands. And once it binds to the adrenal glands, it can lead to the release of epinephrine. So epinephrine or adrenaline, same thing, will then bind to the musculature. So this is a tissue, a muscle tissue. And then from here, we have, if we zoom in, so we're zooming into a single cell of the muscle tissue, so a single muscle cell. Here is our cell membrane, so it's in blue all the way down. This is a T-tubule, so it's a membrane that goes all the way down and then comes back up on the other side. That's not so important. The point is that there's a cell membrane, so this is outside of the cell, and this is inside of the cell. Now here, if we focus specifically on epinephrine, so adrenaline, it will bind to what's known as a beta-2 adrenergic receptor. And this will then lead to a series of changes within the cell. And that's really what I want you to focus on, that adrenaline or epinephrine binds to the outside of the cell, and that leads to a change in the shape of the receptor that is within this cell membrane, so the separation from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, which then leads to an activation of, in this example, cyclic AMP, which then activates pKa, and pKa then has a series of different effects. So it affects what's known as the dihydropyridine receptor and the ryanodine receptor, and ultimately, for both of these, it leads to the release of calcium. So big picture is that adrenaline binds to this receptor, and then we get more release of calcium. Now, why is that important? Why is calcium important? Well, the reason why calcium is important is because calcium triggers muscle contraction. So if you're thinking about lifting performance, or if you're thinking about running performance, cycling performance, rowing performance, any sort of endurance performance, then obviously, then you would want more muscle contraction. You want your cells to be able to contract more effectively. So the more calcium that you have, the better that is able to be done. That was really bad English. Anyway, so pKa can also have an effect on something like glycogenolysis. So it will allow the muscle cells to break down the glucose or the sugar that's already found in the muscle cell, and then be able to use that for the generation of quick ATP. And that's important, that it's quick ATP as opposed to slow ATP production. So quick ATP would be going through a process known as glycolysis, and then that allows for the rapid generation of ATP, because if you're going to be stimulating greater muscle contraction, that muscle contraction also relies on ATP or energy to be able to actually go through muscle contraction. So this is all important. All of this plays a factor in in how muscles are able to contract and therefore give us performance. Also affects ERK, which is another signaling protein, which can affect electrolyte balance so that we actually get what's known as depolarization of the muscle cell. But again, there's a lot of specifics here, and I'm glossing over them. I'm going over them quickly. The point is that adrenaline or epinephrine will activate all of these processes to allow for greater muscle contraction. Now, if this is the exact same thing, believe it or not, this is the exact same image, but with actually greater simplicity. So here we're seeing calcium. You've got calcium entering this muscle cell. This is a single muscle cell, so we're still looking at a muscle cell. And then we've got here this is the ryanodine receptor that I mentioned earlier. So if we go back here, ryanodine receptor right here, so sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a section of the muscle cell, sarcoplasmic reticulum, which houses the calcium. This then opens and releases calcium, and then we've got these muscle fiber, these filaments that then end up contracting so that we can get greater muscle performance. Now, the reason why I'm showing this again is that here we've got our epinephrine, but more specifically, there's also evidence that caffeine, independent of epinephrine, can actually stimulate all of these processes as well. Now, I should caution, however, that caffeine having these effects is at extremely high doses. So we're talking basically toxic doses. So I'm just throwing it in there, but I don't want you to necessarily think that this is a primary mechanism. While it does happen, I wouldn't call it primary because the doses of caffeine to consume would be essentially toxic. But still, interesting to throw in here. Now, another mechanism that I think is not as important for lifting performance, but is important for long duration endurance performance. So if you're running a marathon, for example, then caffeine also has an effect on adipose tissue or fat tissue. So fat cells will then be encouraged to release fat molecules. Now, fat molecules can then go to the muscle cells and be used for ATP generation. Now, as opposed to previously, we talked about glycogenolysis, so the breakdown of sugars for fast generation of ATP. In this situation, we're talking about beta oxidation, which is slow generation of ATP or cellular energy. So as a result, this means that it's probably not going to be that effective for lifting performance that needs really quick energy generation, but it will be highly effective for somebody that's trying to potentially spare their sugar levels in their muscles because they want to tap into a lot more of this huge reserve of energy that we have, which is our fat tissue. Even the leanest of us, even if you have 5% body fat, you have more energy stored in fat than you do in glycogen or stored glucose, stored sugar. So this is another mechanism that would specifically affect endurance, but probably not affect lifting performance. Okay, so those are a few of the mechanisms, as I promised. But now let's go into the actual study. So to start out here, I'd like to focus in on the endurance study. So this endurance study, here we're looking at the different characteristics of the individuals that were recruited for the endurance study. And here we're looking for inconsistencies. So the way to read this is that we've got our AA. So here we've got obviously all of our characteristics, but AA corresponds to fast caffeine metabolism. So this is a gene. So if we go back here, if we were to read this gene, they would have an AA style gene, which means they are fast metabolizers of caffeine. AC is more moderate to slow caffeine metabolism, and CC is definitively slow caffeine metabolism. Now, if you know anything about statistics, typically we look at the p-value here, and if it's anywhere below 0.05, then there's a statistically significant difference between all of these conditions. So what do we find? So if we compare height, between AA, AC, and CC group individuals, so we've got 49 people in the AA condition, we have 44 people in the AC condition, and we've got 8 people in the CC condition. And if we compare them, it may look like there's differences, right, in height, so 179 centimeters, 177 centimeters, 181, but the p-value is not sufficiently different. So it's 0.15, which is above that typical cutoff. There's a lot of nuance here when we're talking about statistics, but if we stick to the law of the land, we're gonna say that is statistically non-significant. It's getting close to different, but it's actually not. Now, if we look at body mass, there does seem to be, we're getting really close. And if I had to venture, if I said that they increase the number of people in the CC group, I'm pretty sure that they would probably see a statistical difference here. So technically, there's no statistical difference. And do I think that body mass would make? Probably body mass would make a difference. So maybe keep that in the back of your mind as we analyze the actual data itself. And of course, and then none of these other aspects end up changing. So caffeine, so the dietary intake of caffeine that they normally consume. Again, if you were to look at like 87 compared to 38, you're thinking that's a huge difference. But the thing is here that they're showing this plus or minus 18. These are the variability of all 49 individuals compact together is 87, but there's a lot of variability. So the statistics take into consideration the uncertainty of these differences. And if there's so much uncertainty in these differences, then the statistics end up reflecting, hey, look, average together, sure, it seems like there's a big difference, but there isn't enough certainty there to actually determine there is a difference. VO2 is a measure of the consumption of oxygen and the release of CO2. There's a bunch of specifics here that you would probably need to look into that I'm not going to cover here. But the point is that the characteristics at baseline before undergoing this actual experimental period with this research, there are very few differences. I would argue that body mass is likely different, but that's up to you if you think that there is a difference there. But the rest of them, there isn't a significant difference. So how did they go about this? Well, they essentially recruited 113 men, and all obviously quite young, so in their 20s, mid-20s, and they had 101 individuals. I'm looking over at my notes here. So 101 individuals that actually finished the study. And it was a crossover design, so meaning that all the participants were exposed to each condition. The two conditions were, well, technically 3 conditions. So 2 main conditions. One condition is consumption of caffeine. So they were given a certain amount of caffeine and then they were tested. Or they were given a placebo, which is a fake treatment. Now, within that caffeine condition, they broke that up into a low caffeine consumption and high caffeine consumption. So they had a 2 milligram per kilogram of body weight and a 4 milligram per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 100 kilograms, then you multiply 2 milligrams by 100, 200 milligrams, or 400 milligrams. And then they had them undergo a bike test at a particular intensity, so 50 watts, and then they wanted to have them reach a particular endpoint as quickly as they possibly could at that particular intensity. And so that's exactly what they measured. They measured the overall effect, which I'll show you right here. So the lower the bar, so obviously the longer it takes to do the experiment, to finish that load, to finish that workload, then they're going to have a larger bar or a higher bar with the greater time. So let's say 18.1 minutes or something along those lines, if we were to roughly estimate this. Now, the lower the bar, obviously, then the exact opposite, that they were able to finish their experimental design or their test, their experiment, in a shorter amount of time, which means that you have better performance when you're talking about endurance. So here, this is all subjects. So they're not discriminating based off of the gene type. So they're not discriminating between the fast metabolizers, the AA, the AC, and the CC. They're just looking at all individuals either on 0 milligrams, so with the placebo, so they did not consume any caffeine, or the low caffeine consumption, 2 milligrams, or the 4 milligrams, which is high caffeine consumption. And across all subjects, they found that if we compare this graph against this graph, or this bar versus this bar, we see that there is a significant difference. That's why they've got an asterisk here. So this asterisk tells us that there's a improved performance at only 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight consumption of caffeine. There was not a statistically significant difference between no caffeine and low caffeine. So one would need to consume at least 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. I believe in the other study that we looked at in my other video, I think it was 3 milligrams or maybe 5 milligrams. The point is that 4 milligrams for sure works. Now, taking this data and then breaking it up based off of genotype, or the actual gene differences, here we're looking at the actual gene differences. Again, AA is fast metabolizers, AC is moderate to slow metabolizers, and CC is slow metabolizers. And we see that, again, stratified based off of the caffeine consumption, that AA individuals do experience. So here we didn't see a difference between the low caffeine and the no caffeine. But here, if we stratify, we do see a difference, because now we're eliminating these individuals and these individuals from the total population. So therefore, if we get more granular, now we can see that there is a difference with low caffeine consumption. So that would mean if you are a fast metabolizer of caffeine, you would see an improved performance with even low caffeine consumption. You would not see an added benefit. So that's something else to consider, that you would not see an added benefit from doubling your caffeine consumption. So at low caffeine consumption, you are seeing an improvement in your performance. And with higher caffeine consumption, although you are still seeing that improvement in performance, you're not seeing an added benefit. So there's no additive effect. Now, looking at the AC individuals, what would you determine here? You would determine that there is no difference across the board. So caffeine has zero impact on performance. Now, the CC individuals, so the really slow caffeine metabolizers, experience a significant detriment to their performance with high caffeine consumption. So high caffeine consumption right here, you see that the time increases. So now they're getting closer to 21 minutes, as opposed to when they didn't consume caffeine, they were around maybe 17 and a half, 18 minutes to be able to finish this effect. Now, a small amount of caffeine does not seem to have an effect, but it could also be that the study was technically underpowered, because if we go back here, what that means is that they didn't have enough participants to be able to tell the difference. Remember, here for the AA group, they have 49 individuals, AC, they have 44 individuals, and the CC, they only have 8 individuals. So it's possible that there just isn't enough statistical power there to tease out the difference. But what we do know for sure is that a higher caffeine consumption is actually detrimental to the performance benefits. So if you're an individual that metabolizes caffeine very slowly, then you should avoid caffeine if you want that performance benefit. Or I guess I should say, if you want to not hurt your performance. There we go. I think that's probably the more accurate way to go about or say things. Okay, so this is really interesting. But what about for lifting performance? All right, so lifting performance here, let me switch over my notes to the study design for this. Okay, for this, they recruited 22 young resistance trained, so, beginners, but not complete beginner resistance trained men that were recruited for the study. and then they ended up coming into the lab for testing. So they were acquainted with the lab equipment one day, and then they came in another time to actually, as in not that they introduced themselves to the lab equipment. Hi, how do you do, Mr. Barbell? No, they were given an opportunity to kind of test out the benches and stuff like that, because sometimes if you are exposed to a new stimulus, to a new situation, that can throw off your effects. So if they measured the first time, if they measured the baseline measures right away, then it could throw off the results, because the next time that they come in, it may not be a caffeine effect, but it may be just because they're more familiar with the equipment. Because the first time that you go to the gym compared to like the 60th time that you go to the gym, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable with the situation, what's going on around you, with the actual, how the equipment works, how it fits your body well, how to adjust it. Those kinds of things can make a big difference, and that can skew the results. So the first time they came in, they were just like, hey, test out the equipment, see how you feel on it, and then we'll have you come in a few weeks or a few days once you've rested up from that, and don't work out during that time. And then when you come back in for the baseline, then we're going to do you're going to use the exact same equipment. You're going to do a baseline measurement. So what they did was a 1 rep max, a 1 repetition maximum lift. So they did, in this case, they did a bench press. So they lifted the weight one time until they could lift the maximum amount of weight, 1 repetition maximum, with good form. And then what they did is they had these individuals end up consuming a certain amount of caffeine, and then tested them again. Not the same day, obviously, because if they did a 1 repetition maximum at baseline, then they can't have them do it again, because their body's going to be worn out. So then that might mask the difference. So they did the 1 rep max, then they left, they recovered for a few days, then they came back, consumed caffeine, and ended up doing the 1 rep max again. All right, so, and then of course they ended up separating them based off of, in this situation, 2 groups, so 2 gene groups. So here we've got our AA group. This is, again, the same thing, fast metabolizers. They had 13 individuals in this one. And then they combined the AC, the slower, moderate to slow metabolizers, with the really slow metabolizers that we experienced in the last study, grouped them together. So with ending up with 9 individuals. Again, similar ages, kind of late 20s, mid to late 20s, and no significant differences on body mass, height, and 1 rep max with respect to the bench press, and habitual caffeine intake. So they did habitually consume some caffeine. So this isn't novice people that have never consumed caffeine before. So what do we find? Well, I've simplified things here. So I created a graph to actually indicate the effect here. So here we've got our no caffeine. So this is before they consume caffeine. And they ended up doing 85% of 1 rep max. So they came in, did the 1 rep max, then they came in on a separate day, and the researchers had loaded the bench press bar with 85% of that 1 rep max, and they said, lift this as many times as you possibly can. Then they left again, so they did that, and then they left again, and then they came back in after they'd recuperated, and the researchers said, okay, take this caffeine, or probably didn't say take this caffeine. It was probably a pill of some sort, so they didn't know what they were consuming. And then the researchers said, okay, now after 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, do this exercise again and see how you feel. Do as many repetitions as you can. Okay, so here we've got our no caffeine in the AA condition. So this is specifically in the fast metabolizers. Then we've got caffeine with in the AA individuals with caffeine consumption, which I believe was something like 3 or 4, maybe 5 milligrams per kilogram. I don't remember exactly. I'll post it below in my kind of a pinned comment, so you can actually see how much they ended up consuming. I think it was maybe like 5 milligrams per kilogram. If it's anything different than that, I'll post something. And then they've got the no caffeine with the slower metabolizers of caffeine, and again, the same situation, but with caffeine consumption. And if we compare, so first, there's two comparisons to be made here. One comparison is to compare no caffeine versus caffeine, and the other comparison is to compare the caffeine versus caffeine. So to look at the differences between the genotypes, or the genes. And what we find is that with no caffeine, they were able to lift roughly about 7 repetitions. We look at this line right here. Don't look at this line specifically. So this line is an indication of what's known as the standard error of the mean, which means that it gives you, whenever I get into statistics, it's tough to, without making sure that your eyes don't glaze over. But looking at standard error of the mean is essentially looking at, in really general terms, the certainty of the mean. So the mean is this line right here. And this is kind of giving you an indication of what the true mean really is. It could lie anywhere within this line. But the statistics have indicated that it's most likely right in this point. But there is obviously some level of uncertainty. That's where I'm going to drop that, because there's more complexity to it, and I'm sure somebody that's even more knowledgeable than I am in statistics is probably rolling their eyes. But truly, without going into statistics on all this kind of stuff, it's just difficult. It's just difficult to explain the physiology, explain the data, and explain the statistics all in one go. So that's where we're going to leave it. So we're comparing this line against this line. And this is, of course, we can't just use our eyes. We also have to look if there's an indication that there is actually a statistically significant difference. So what do we find? So if by comparison there's maybe 7 repetitions they were able to accomplish with no caffeine in the fast metabolizers, and with the same group, when they consume caffeine, they were able to get up to about 8. Now, was that statistically significant? The answer is yes. So there was again a caffeine effect, and this is true for the other research that we've looked at, specifically looking at caffeine's effect on lifting performance. So it does let you eke out an extra repetition on your lifting performance. There's more nuance to that. You can check out my other content specifically on that, and I'll post a link for you as well. But the point is that you see an improvement. Now, do we see that improvement again with the no caffeine group? Well, we see again that the no caffeine group maybe got around 7.5 repetitions, something like that. You can get half a repetition in that. You're not looking at a single individual. You're grouping a number of individuals. I believe it was 8, 9, something like that. 9 individuals. So you're going to get fractions in that situation. So let's say 7.5 repetitions. And when they ended up consuming caffeine, we find that they got about 8.5 repetitions, something like that. So they saw an improvement in their lifting performance. Now, if we compare those two, it turns out that there is no significant difference between the two genotypes. Now, really what you would want to measure is the difference between these two and the difference between these two, because clearly these people are starting at a different point as these people, because these people may be just a little bit stronger in general. So it would be unfair to say, oh, let's just look at this bar graph versus this bar graph. We have to actually look at the difference. So let's say if these individuals gained 2 repetitions and these individuals only gained 1 repetition, sure, they may be higher in an absolute sense looking at this bar graph versus this bar graph, but they technically saw worse effects or worse benefit, not as much of a benefit from caffeine consumption. So that it's kind of a side note, but it's something that's important when you're analyzing research. So, but the point is that there was no difference between the two genotypes. So let me give you a bit of a conclusion, a summary of what we just went over, because I realize that a lot of this stuff is tough to go. It's tough to. I'm showing you data. I'm talking fast. I'm trying to explain things. I'm making sure that I'm not explaining too much stuff. It's a lot. So what can we take away? So caffeine increases performance, both in lifting and endurance performance. However, those with a slow caffeine metabolism, so specifically the CC individuals with that gene, experience worse performance in endurance. This was not the case for lifting performance so far. Now, the reason why I put so far here is because this alludes to these 2 points right here. So again, if you want a complete analysis of what I have on related to these studies, then hop on over to the Physionic Insiders, where I will explain how caffeine affects power output, so the speed at which we're able to lift weights, and also a major problem that I haven't discussed in the analysis up to this point. So if you're interested in that, then jump over to the Physionic Insiders. And with that, I hope that you learned something, and I'll hope to speak with you in the near future. Have a good one. Bye.